somewhere in the world, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Was informed this morning, there's my bell, that Willie Mae will not be here today, that she has called her son that's going to take her to the ER. She's just not feeling well. Barbara said she tried to get her to go yesterday, but that didn't work, so she's going to the ER this morning. Brother Terry has his appointment tomorrow. My son had his lumbar puncture Friday, so all we got to do now is wait on the test to come back, see what's going on there. Of course, keep Janice in your prayers. Kevin's dad just talked about him, and the chemo didn't do any good. They're doing radiation, but that's affecting the ocular nerve, so he's not going to be able to get any vision back in that eye, and he's legally blind in the other eye. So just need to keep that family in our prayers. Is there anyone I've missed? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Anyone else? Brother Bobby, would you lead us in a prayer then before we begin our study? If you was here Wednesday night, Brother Clunch got us down through verse 9, I believe it was, but I'm going back up to verse 9 in chapter 7 of Revelation. And he had talked about the numbers, the 144,000, and how that was not a real number. This book is symbolism. He also made reference to the point that it couldn't be that because a couple of the tribes were not mentioned, and a couple of tribes that are not mentioned are those that were, if you want to use the word bad, they were the sort of the worst of the lot as far as trying to, what they would do, idolatry and things of that nature. So we're getting into non-numbers, but the 144,000, the way that number is reached is when you get to 1,000, 10 times 10 times 10, 10 in Hebrew was a perfect number. And then the 12 tribes, and then 12,000 from each tribe. So you can work your way into just rounding it off as being a symbol to the Jews that the perfect ones are gonna make it. Now, there are some religious groups that teach that there will only be a flat number of 144,000 that make it to heaven, and those have already been chosen. There are other groups that say that there'll be 144,000 that make it to heaven, and the rest of those that are good are going to live on the refurbished earth after it's been destroyed and refurbished. The way I look at the book of Revelation and study it, neither one of those two match up anywhere along the lines, because we're all told that we're going to go to heaven if we do what's right. Now, also, there are some that want the 144,000 to represent both Old and New Testament, all Christians through the ages. However, I believe the verse that we're getting to points out something a little bit differently. I believe that if you look at it, what Brother Clonch was talking about in the 144,000 Wednesday night, that is addressing those that lived under the Jewish Mosaical law, those that were saved under that law, then those are going to make it, because the next verse, in verse 9, says, "After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations, all kin and kindreds, and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands." So the white robes are the purity, and the palms, that's what they used when they, on the road to Jerusalem, when they was not paving, but in essence, paving the way for Christ to come in. So to me, anyway, it looks as though these two things here, when you put it together, it is one part is talking to the Jews, those that lived under the old covenant, and now we have switched gears and looking at Gentiles. If it was only going to be the 144,000, those from the tribes of Israel, what happens to all the Gentiles? And see, that's where the change took place when Christ was nailed to the cross. His blood flowed backwards to cover all those that had been obedient to that law, and now we're told what we must do to be cleansed by his blood in the new law. So also, Brother Terry mentioned the fact Wednesday night that I personally believe in the early date, and a lot of this I think has to do with Jerusalem, whereas he thinks that it was the late date and it applied to Rome. That doesn't matter at all when you look at it, and we don't need to shade our opinions and try to make them fit something. If we just look at it and address it as we go along, I think we can all get to the same point. Now, the reason that I personally think that part of it had to do with Jerusalem is if you go back to the book of Matthew in chapter 24. What does the book of Matthew 24 do? Jesus is talking to them and telling them that all these things are going to be destroyed. It's going to happen in that generation. And what is he referring to? Destruction of Jerusalem. What happens around verse 36 in that chapter? We switch gears from what's going to happen to Jerusalem to now what's going to happen future. And I kind of think that's the way the book of Revelation works. Part of it pertains to this, part of it pertains to that, and part of it is yet future. It's what people have a tendency to do sometime when they look at the book of Revelation is they want it to be chronological, right on through. I look at it more as we get to certain sections, it works just like the Gospels in the book of in the New Testament. What do the Gospels do? The four Gospels overlap. They go back and repeat things. So it's sort of like peeling an onion. You take this layer and now you get to this layer. Some things back up a little bit, as we say, get a running start. And at least that's the way I see it. Questions, comments so far? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, sir. Very good. That's a good point you make too. And if I could take the time to do it, we could probably spend 3 years just on this book, because the way it makes sense to me is if you take the book of Daniel, the 24th chapter of Matthew, and the book of Revelation and lay them down and study them together, it sort of, at least to me, pulls things together and makes things make a little more sense. But not wanting to confuse anybody here. So verse 10 says, and cried with a loud voice. Well, let me back up. After I beheld this, a great multitude that no man could number, of all nations, kindreds, and people, and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, palms in their hands, and cried with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb. Now, this is a sort of a different way of speaking. They're not talking about salvation to the one sitting on the throne. They're talking about salvation coming from the one on the throne, because they weren't able to do anything for the person on the throne, but Christ on the throne was the one that was able to shed his blood and create salvation for everyone. And all the angels stood around the throne and about the elders and the four beasts, and fell before the throne on their faces and worshiped God. If you'll notice that whole setting now, if we go back to verse 1 of this chapter all the way through verse 11, what can we get together? There's the throne with the ruler on the throne. There's the 24 elders around the throne. There's the 144 symbolically from the old. There's the multitudes that you can't number, the Gentiles and the new. There are the angels and the four beasts. And what are they all doing? Worshiping the one. So that's where we are to this point in that. Again, questions, comments? Verse 12 then, what they were saying was amen, which blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be unto our God forever and ever. Amen. And one of the elders answered, saying unto me, what are these which are arrayed in white robes, and whence came they? When we look at the word answered, one of the elders answered. We've talked about this some before, but we need to bring it up again. This is the way that they talked back then. When we use the word answer today, what do we mean? Somebody has asked us a question, and we are responding to that question. It was their way of speaking where somebody hadn't asked them a question yet, but they just wanted to respond to something. And so John said, and I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. And he said unto me, these are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. If you take this one verse and this one verse alone, which we're not to do, we don't try to make things stand on their own. We try to make sure that it fits with everything else. But if you will look at the importance of this one verse and start with the great tribulation, who are they which came out of great tribulation? All the Christians that are faithful have gone under some kind of tribulation throughout the ages. And if you look at it from that angle, it goes back and fits perfectly with what we just said. There were those from the old covenant. There are those from the new covenant. And he said that they are those that have washed their robes. And how do you wash your robes? Through your obedience, having the blood of Christ cleanse you of your sins. So that's sort of an oxymoron in itself. How can you wash something in blood and it come out pure white? But the idea is we're not talking about a physical cleansing, we're talking about a spiritual cleansing. And it was Christ's blood that was shed that allowed for our cleansing, for us to be perfectly whole and perfectly righteous when we get to heaven. Verse 15 then says, For are they before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple, and he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them. Again, I've used this before, but if you go back to the book of Genesis, God was walking with man in the Garden of Eden. When man sinned and was cast out of the garden, now there's that separation. Now, all of those that have been obedient and go to heaven, now God is in their midst again in heaven. So it's just sort of gone full circle there. Yes, sir. Right. Good point. Brother Clarence just pointed out that when he was talking about day and night, we know there's no sun in heaven, that Christ is the light. So since we're in a book of symbols, that is just representative of the whole day. Sorry? Forever and ever. Verse 16 says, they shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun light on them, nor any heat. If you go back into Scripture, if you go back into the book of John, chapter 4, when Jesus meets the woman at the well, what does he tell her? He has the water of life. If you drink the water that I provide, you will never thirst anymore. And she says, give me some of that water. So if we go back and look at that, and then if we look at chapter 22 of the book of Revelation, this is one of the few times I go ahead, because when I study the book, I like for everything to build on itself. But in this particular point, if you go to chapter 22 in verse 1, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, as clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. So again, where does that water of life come from? And what was offered to the woman at the well back in John? And it all ties together. And when we get down to the heat, if you'll go back to Isaiah 49 and verse 10, Brother Joel, you fast with your fingers. Can you find Isaiah 49 and verse 10 real quick? Okay, so that goes, again, that ties the Old Testament, Isaiah, up to what we're talking about right now too, that the heat refers to those that have had to be out in the fields working and all. And then verse 17 says, for the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them and shall lead them into living fountains of water, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Again, if you go back to Isaiah 25 and verse 8, Isaiah 25 and verse 8. Okay, so what we see happening here in the book of Revelation with John talking through his visions goes right back to what the prophets in the Old Testament have prophesied, have foretold. Questions or comments then on chapter 7? Again, we have to recall specifically who the seven letters were written to, and when it was written, and what they were going through at the time, what was happening immediately, whether it's the 60s AD or 90s AD, what is happening to the group, the churches in Asia at this time, those 7 churches. If you go into the 60s, the first and worst and most terrible of the emperors was on the throne, Nero, heavy persecution. If you go into the period of the 90s, Domitian, there's a lot of literature that calls him a reincarnate of Nero. So either way you go, whether you want it this or that, you're still looking at what they're undergoing at the time as famines and hardships and all of that nature. So when God comes in and takes over and gives them that fountain of life and wipes away their tears, a lot of symbolism there, but a lot of reality too. We will be at peace. Brother Golden, you look like you're trying to. That is a good point, because if you also want to look at it in that respect, we today, we're sealed, aren't we? Nothing can come in and get us unless we step outside. You know, we can release ourselves from the seal, but as long as we do what we're supposed to, we are protected. And when it comes to the battle between God and Satan, God limits what Satan can do. Remember the verse that says, obey God and well, that, and then if you honor God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you, is the one I'm trying to come up with. So it is in our power. We have total power, whether we let the devil in or we don't let him in. And that's the parameters that God has set on him and his angels, those that can affect us. Again, any more questions, comments on chapter 7? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If you didn't hear Brother Clance, he said, couldn't we at least take it up through Constantine until he legitimized Christianity? But then we have the advantage of just sitting looking back. If you see everything that went on in Europe all the way up through, from that period all the way up, how there were certain periods of time where they could worship openly. There were certain periods of time when they had to hide. There were certain, even during the 1500s, when they was trying to put a Bible in everybody's hand. And that persecution came from a religious group, putting them in prison for trying to get a Bible into the hands of people. So all through the ages, there's been tribulation, some more severe than others. Yeah. Right now, it's more on a verbal and legal than it is a physical, but you are correct. There is interference taking place. Chapter 8 starts out with, and when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of a half an hour. What does it mean to have a period of silence? Reflection? Yes, sir. Uh, but in context here, I'm more inclined to go along with Dave, and let me add to that by just a little bit. When we have a moment of silence, a lot of times it is for reflection, it is for anxiety, anticipation. If you've ever, pardon, respect. If you've ever gone to some of these, well, an opera or some show that has intermission and you leave and come back, what do? They'll flash the lights or give you some kind, and everybody gets in, everybody gets quiet. You're waiting on what's about to come. If you really want to intimidate someone that you're counseling, questioning, or talking to, don't say anything. Just look at them. Ten seconds will seem like an eternity. But if you're really wanting to get a point across and get somebody to think, Dave, when's the last time you was in jail? Yeah. But doesn't that make you want to say something? Well, anyway, I believe that that's what this silent part means here. Not that he's trying to intimidate, but the point of it is that there is silence. You know there's something about to come, and it's going to be a big announcement, and you're just waiting on it. So there's the silence, the respect, the anticipation, and the waiting. And then in verse 2, he says, And I saw the seven angels which God stood before God. Or, excuse me, let me start over. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. And another angel came and stood at the altar having a golden censer. What would be a golden censer? Carries incense. It could be considered a fire pan or something that would hold hot coals or something hot. And there was, yes, sir. Right. And we can even go into and look at the walls of Jericho, for instance, as trumpets being a call. Um, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. Uh, before we get into that, look at Luke chapter 1 and verse 9. Okay, so if we take that as what was customary at that time, and we look at this, he had a golden censer, and what was the representation of incense? The smoke. No, ma'am, it was the smoke back in the was representing prayers going up. So hear much incense, so that meant that there was going to be a lot of prayers going up to the throne for all saints. And the smoke of the incense, which came with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. Ezekiel 10:2. Ezekiel 10:2. I'm just going to let you do it, brother. Okay. Again, tying back to some old things that these people knew. They knew their Bible, or they knew the history. So this just says that the angels took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, threw it down to the earth, and all of this was taking place. Verse 6, and the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Now, by preparing, as we go on through the rest of this, it appears as though they got in order that they were going to sound. It wasn't that they were all getting it up to their lips to do it at one time. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burned up, and all grass was burned up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. Now, the reason I read all of that at the same time, well, let me go on just a little bit further. And the third angel sounded, fell from heaven as it were the lamp, and the name of the star is called wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many people died of the waters because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. The reason I read all of that is if you stop and look at the things that happen on each of those four, instead of getting confused by what was happening to the four, I think it will make more sense to you. In other words, the four trumpets were a complete sphere. And if you look at the cycle of judgment that those four trumpets had, what was it? It was land, it was sea, it was river, and it was light. What else is there? That makes up the complete, doesn't it? So a third of it, of the complete, then was under judgment from this first trumpet. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Since you mentioned that, let's jump ahead just a little bit here. If we will go over to chapter 9 and verse 12. Chapter 9 and verse 12. And everything is happening in segments like we've talked about. So in chapter 9 and verse 12, it says, One woe is past, and behold, two woes more hereafter. So one's done, two more is coming. If we then skip over to chapter 11 and verse 14, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So again, by thirds, you're taking it on the one of the verses we'll read here in a few minutes about the angel saying, "Woe, woe, woe." So there's three woes, and that goes down to say that things are happening in three. There'll be a third here, and a third here taking place. So, and that's, matter of fact, that's in the very next verse, verse 13. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels, which are yet to sound. It mentions earth, that this went down to earth. Brother Golden, was you trying to get a comment in? Right. That's okay. Yeah, we're taking it in those chunks. Also, this is a good time for us to also understand the pan that was thrown down to earth. Earth represents power and the center of power. And if you go along with it being Jerusalem, the seat of the power in Jerusalem, not the Jews, was Jerusalem, but that was power. If you look at it being Rome, the center of power was still earthly. It was in Rome, of the Roman Empire. So as you look at this first third, I guess you could say, that it dealt with the physical, as Brother Golden just pointed out, the land, sea, river, and light part. Questions or comments in on verse 9? That is correct. That is correct. And since you mentioned that, what does Peter tell us? That the heavens and the earth will burn up, melt away, which indicates then that these religious groups that talk about a certain group being back on earth, the refurbished earth, nowhere in Scripture can I read where there's a refurbished earth that's waiting on anybody. Yep. That's it. Any other questions or comments on chapter 8? Start with chapter 9. I've only got a few minutes here, but Brother Klotch had informed me that he was going to have to be out of town Wednesday night, so you're going to have to put up with me again Wednesday night, but I'll pick up where we leave off. So the fifth angel then sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. Now, if we look back at Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, Luke 10 and 18. Okay. When we go back into the Old Testament and we see the falling constellations or falling light, it generally means that someone of power is being taken down. So here, the one that is falling and is going to have the key to the bottomless pit, first off, who is in the bottomless pit? Who is locked up in the bottomless pit? Satan and his band. So the one that's going to fall down and be given the key is going to be someone that is one of his uh, personalities, that we'll use that phrase, to have the key to open it and let things happen. Again, who's in charge? God. When he gives somebody the key to the bottomless pit to let things happen, is it going to be any restrictions on that, or is it going to be all out? There's going to be those restrictions, those boundaries. We can go back to several verses where God has allowed Satan to do certain things, but no more. So, yes, sir. That's correct. That is, again, Brother Clance pointed out that the symbolism here, that no star is small enough to hit the earth without destroying the earth. And there's no pit that is bottomless. We call them bottomless, but if it were bottomless, if it went all the way through the earth, you'd reach the other side of the earth, wouldn't you? It'd be a tunnel. This may not fit exactly, but when we're talking about words and symbolisms and how things come into being, everyone in here has heard the term skyscraper, haven't you? Do you know where the word skyscraper originated? What the first use of the word skyscraper was? A man was referring to a tall horse. And look where we have come. So, but to that person, that horse was so big, he scraped the sky. Yes, sir. Right. Well, again, the symbolism, if you go back into the book of Ezekiel, what happened there? The star fell, the person in power fell. So this was a person that was had enough, was in a position where when he came down, he could be given the key, be given the authority to do things. Verse 2 says, he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. Now, I kind of like this particular chapter because we get into a lot of fantasy, because we're talking about locusts, but the locusts had the power of scorpions. Where does a locust generally, where does their power come from? They gnaw. It comes from the head. Where is the power of the scorpion? In the tail. So here now we have the vision of locusts that's going to go out and cover this area, and they have the power of scorpions. Right. Verse 4, and it was commanded then that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. All right. What do locusts do? They consume vegetation. Here they're told not to do what their nature is, that they are to inflict those men that have not the seal of God in their forehead. Now, who has the seal of God in their forehead? Those who are sealed, as we have already discussed, those that are obedient. So the rest of the world, those that are not in that protective shield, are the ones that are free to the devouring here. And to them was given that they should not kill them. That's a good place to stop. We'll pick up there Wednesday night, Lord willing. Verse 5. Thank y'all so much for your comments and your attention.